Crick and Mitchison lay out a hypothesis for what happens during REM sleep, in which they propose a process of reverse learning takes place when we get REM sleep. They state that by isolating an association you have made and stimulating it repeatedly, the structure will diminish over time. As such, they advise that you do not try to remember your dreams, as you may bring parasitic modes that you've been trying to get rid of in REM sleep back up to the surface. But this is just plain wrong because in psychotherapy, dreams actually have healing properties. They state that non-REM dreams are probably dreams consolidating information, while REM dreams are attacking parasitic modes. They use neural networks as a model for interpreting what happens during REM sleep, as well as why both adults and infants get a significant portion of REM sleep at night, which combines developmental psychology with general adult psychology. I will be covering a few key components, such as what happens during REM sleep, the neocortex, properties of neuronal networks, associations, and parasitic modes. What happens in the brain when we get REM sleep? Your muscles relax and the cortex is very active. Monoamine neurons in the brainstem, especially in the locus coeruleus, raphe, and peribranchial nuclei, reduce their firing rates in REM so that only a fraction of neurons are still active. Non-REM dreams are thought-like, while REM dreams have perceptual vividness and an illogical episodic structure. The forebrain is occasionally and widely stimulated by the brainstem. Whenever this occurs, PGO waves are produced, rapid eye movements occur, and new parts of a dream are added. PGO waves typically mean that a dream is incoming and someone is slipping into REM sleep or is experiencing REM sleep. The neocortex consists of many axon collaterals which usually link back up with its soma. These are for self-regulating the firing rate of the cell. Axon collaterals in the neocortex originate locally and run within a given area, so an axon collateral in the parietal cortex wouldn't typically project to another area of the cortex. Axon collaterals aren't found to be nearly as dense in other brain structures as they are in the neocortex. Most synapses in the cortex are excitatory, and this would allow for self-excitatory modes of behavior, cognition, and affect within the cortex, meaning that you can self-stimulate a certain association. Neural networks are integral to understanding this paper, as much of what the research at the time was based on was hypothetical constructs of how neurons interact with one another. Information would have to be stored in the strength of synapses, as in how much you use that structure or how deeply ingrained it is in you. So, you're pretty good at remembering and using psychology, but aren't very good at building houses, as you use psychology far more than you build houses. The information would not be confined to a specific neuron or location, as it would have to be distributed across many neurons. The information is not lost entirely when synapses are added or removed, as some of it is still stored elsewhere. One synapse would store multiple bits of information at the same time, as the neuron before its firing pattern would have all the information about the one previous to it. General properties emerge from these assumptions. Completion, with only part of the input, the entire output can be produced. An example would be answering a question before you've completely read it. Classification, input related to several of its associations may result in an output consisting of a combination of common features of normal output. An example could be you can talk, you can walk, you can also talk and walk at the same time. Overloading. Due to the superimposed nature of storage, if you try to store too many associations, you can become overloaded as a result of too much overlapping information, which would be there's too much on your cognitive plate. General results of overloading would be far-fetched or bizarre associations, or fantasy, getting stuck in a loop, or obsession, and responding to inappropriate input, which normally results in no response, or hallucinations. The results of overloading make a case for why schizophrenia could be a failure of the reverse learning mechanism, which will be addressed later on. An array of neurons organized like the cortex is could store associations. That is, if every cell is associated with a specific event, when that event occurs and you perceive it, the neuron which receives this information relays it to the pattern of associations which takes care of the event it has experienced previously. Once the event is perceived, the pattern of firing that comes after it is in accordance with some structure which stores associations, meaning that when you perceive something close enough to what you've experienced before, or you can fill in the gaps between your knowledge with context, you can act in accordance with your environment. You see a dog, you think about the dog, ask yourself questions about the dog. Is it a dog? Is the dog friendly? Does context provide me with the ability to pet the dog? And then you pet the dog. Parasitic modes. These are a maladaptive collection of neurons which store a pathological association. An association could consist of how you perceive an object and how it affects your affect, behavior, and cognition. So, when you perceive a ball in a given context, an association could perform a series of actions, as in picking up and throwing the ball. A parasitic mode stores a pathological association. So, when you perceive a drug, the parasitic mode kind of takes over for you, and does the thing you usually do with a drug, that is, consume it. Parasitic modes are formed during gestation and by experience. A parasitic mode is essentially a bad brain structure. It is the things that you do that are annoying or disruptive to your current functioning. How to get rid of a parasitic mode. The parasitic mode is isolated, so now it can't receive any input or give any output. The parasitic mode is given successive random internal activation via axon collaterals. This causes the initial stage of the parasitic mode to be activated, but does not allow it to produce any output. It's like the concept of systematic desensitization. You isolate a certain association, which could be a fear of dogs, then you make them respond to pictures of dogs but not allow them to run or look away. Therefore, you desensitize yourself to the response you typically do, instead making the thing provoking anxiety become a normal everyday occurrence. Significance of experimental findings. How the results were interpreted at the time. Such a theory postulates that if it can be tested, we will know more about the function and evolution of the neocortex. That is, either the neocortex is designed for dreaming, isolating parasitic modes, and strong associations, or the neocortex has some other function, but at least we can know that this specific theory is wrong or does not work with what we know now. Crick and Mitchison proposed that a partial failure of the reverse learning function could be responsible for disorders such as schizophrenia, as schizophrenic thinking seems to be dreamlike and corresponds to what happens when a neural network becomes overloaded in theory. That is, far-fetched or bizarre associations, fantasy, getting stuck in a loop, obsession, and responding to inappropriate input, hallucination. Significance today. We know that long-term potentiation likely corresponds to the processing of day residues in dreaming. You practice what you've done throughout the day in your imagination and in your dreams. Long-term depression, on the other hand, seems to fall under the category of reverse learning, and it also seems to reflect what happens during systematic desensitization. Significance to society. Even if this theory is wrong, it may be interesting to implement into AI learning, or in a neural network model of a brain. Using this reverse learning theory in AI would allow multiple parasitic modes to be weaned out of the AI. It could be especially applicable to an AI which processes many things in parallel with one another, has a learning mechanism, and a small degree of randomness when constructed. So using reverse learning to extinguish many parasitic modes at the same time, an AI could learn the right answer, or come to multiple right answers, for a specific problem it is working on, faster. Merits and limitations. Limitations. No figures. Crick and Mitchison included no figures, diagrams, or pictures of any kind. Including figures would make this paper a lot easier to understand, as I have already demonstrated. Lack of evidence. They themselves acknowledge a majority of their theories based on pure speculation, with a lot of their theory coming from neural networks rather than real brains. REM deprivation. It is difficult to study what happens when you don't get enough REM sleep because there tends to be a rebound effect, where you get more REM on subsequent nights or even start to get REM to sleep during your waking state. Merits. Exploration. The fact that they have tried to piece together a theory for REM sleep is still admirable, even with these limitations. In my opinion, it's always better to try before you have all the pieces than it is to wait for the pieces to come to you. Comprehensive. Their theory, while difficult to understand at a glance, still has a comprehensive narrative to it, meaning they covered all their bases and ensured there weren't any obvious holes in their logic. Is it applicable to modern research? It's not all-inclusive. It describes a counter to what we now believe dreams do. Nowadays we have access to a lot more information about what the brain is actually doing while we dream. For starters, instead of REM sleep functioning to isolate, excite, and subsequently extinguish parasitic modes, it is more likely that it is processing what is known as day residues. Day residues are basically memories you form throughout the day, and REM sleep seems to function to consolidate and integrate day residues with what you already know. We can know this because we can see patterns of activation during the day being replayed during REM sleep, meaning you're dreaming about what you do, think, feel, and perceive. The visual aspects of dreaming could be the function of the temporal-occipital junction in the cortex, as activation of this generally occurs when a subject reports a visual dream after you wake them, while activation of the limbic system is associated with emotional dreams. George Christos investigated how Crick and Mitchison's reverse learning theory would work in the Hopfield neural network, which was one of the most advanced neural networks of its time. Christos found that in a dynamic model that mimics the process of learning and unlearning, the reverse learning mechanism did allow the network to forget old memories to make space for new ones. But it's not improved by reducing or inflating the ratio of reverse learning to actual learning. On the other hand, it is a protective factor against overloading. Doidge uses this paper by Crick and Mitchison to promote the idea of unlearning and association, but due to the paper excluding the learning aspect of dreams in favor of an unlearning concept, this paper has fallen behind in modern research. It would make sense that there are two reasons for dreaming: strengthening connections and integrating day residues being one, and weakening connections and identifying parasitic modes being another. In this way, we can maximize normal functioning while dispensing with parasitic modes.